Depression in Indigenous Youth by Caroline Yeager, Amy Tangeman, Killian Yerka, and Emily Martin. Neuroscientific process of depression. Depression is not a one-shoe-fits-all diagnosis. There are many different forms of depression that can experience many different symptoms and can be influenced by many different things, some genetically and some environmentally. So when we talk about depression or neural pathways of depression, we have to kind of come up with a general framework concept for what is depression. Right now we have depression defined as, in general, there is a hypoactivity in brain regions involved in positively motivated behavior, meaning that in these brain regions there is a decrease in brain activity than you would see in somebody who has not been diagnosed with depression. And then in brain regions involved in stress responses, we see a hyperactivity, meaning that there is an increase in these brain regions firing and that the stress response is kind of working overtime. So this is just the proposed neural pathways that underlie the most common symptoms of depression. And down in the bottom right corner, we have a photo of two pairs of neurotransmitters, one in individuals that do not have depression, otherwise labeled as normal, and then the other pair on the right is with individuals that have been diagnosed with depression. And you can see that in the normal neurotransmitters, we have neurotransmitters being sent into the synaptic cleft to then be picked up by the postsynaptic neuron, and the signals will continue to get sent. In individuals with depression, there are not as many neurotransmitters being sent into the synaptic cleft, therefore we're not getting as many signals being sent down to more neurons. So what are the neurotransmitters involved in depression? There are many different neurotransmitters that can be involved in depression depending on the type of depression and the symptoms experienced. But when we tend to talk about neurotransmitters in depression, we kind of tend to talk about the big three, which is dopamine, norepinephrine, and serotonin. Dopamine functions in positive feelings associated with reward and motivation. These are those positively motivated behaviors that we talked about before. In depression, we see that dopamine tends to be downregulated in these dopamine releasing neurons and the dopamine receptors, meaning that we're getting less dopamine released into the brain, and also less of it is attaching to the receptors. This leads to an inability to inhibit from prefrontal cortex to amygdala, resulting in the upregulation of the amygdala activity, and this is known to cause fear and intense anxiety. This is why we kind of tend to see anxiety and depression be coupled together. The norepinephrine functions in our fight or flight response, regulation of our heart rate and our blood pressure, regulation of our blood glucose levels and appetite, as well as the activation of immunoresponse. So norepinephrine is synthesized by dopamine, and when we have a downregulation of dopamine, this means that we're going to have a downregulation of norepinephrine. And this is associated with difficulty in mobilizing for activity, attention, or energy. So these are our low energy levels that we're tending to see with depression. And our last neurotransmitter is serotonin, which functions in the association of mood regulation, sleep, and learning and memory. So downregulation of serotonin is due to depletion of tryptophan.
Indigenous youth in the United States face unique challenges that significantly impact their mental health. There are 574 federally recognized tribes, with over 7 million people identifying as American Indian or Alaska Native. Among them, youth under 18 make up 28% of American Indian or Alaska Native populations. Unfortunately, Indigenous youth experience mental health disparities at alarming rates. They are 25 to 30% more likely to suffer from depression compared to their non-Indigenous peers, and in some tribal communities, up to 50% of adolescents report depressive symptoms. The suicide crisis is even more concerning. Suicide is the second leading cause of death for American Indian Alaska Native youth ages 10 to 24, and they are 2.5 times more likely to die by suicide than the national average. Females in this group, aged 15 to 24, had the highest suicide attempt rates of any racial or ethnic group. These disparities are rooted in historical trauma, systematic marginalization, and socioeconomic inequalities. The forced assimilation of Indigenous children through Indian boarding schools stripped them of their language and traditions, leading to intergenerational trauma that still affects their mental health today. Economic hardships also play a role. 1 in 3 Indigenous youth live below the poverty line, and unemployment rates in Indigenous communities are often double the national average. Adding to these challenges is the lack of mental health resources. In rural reservations, there is often only one mental health provider for every 30,000 individuals. Despite these barriers, cultural identity plays a protective role. Studies show that Indigenous youth who maintain strong cultural connections and tribal traditions have lower rates of depression and suicide. However, many Western healthcare systems fail to incorporate community-based healing approaches like talking circles and ceremonies, which are essential for Indigenous mental well-being. Understanding these challenges is crucial in addressing the mental health crisis among Indigenous youth.
Many Indigenous peoples within the United States still speak their native languages, often using terms to categorize illness and signify stress not traditionally recognized or understood by Western standards. The location of these tribes are described as the areas with the most prevalent population, but there's still recognition that diasporic Indigenous peoples spread all over the states from various tribes and cultures. Ghost sickness is a condition recognized among many nations within the Southwest and Southern Plains regions, including the Navajo, Hopi, Cheyenne, and Lakota populations, among many more. It can be described as the belief that a person is being haunted or possessed by a ghost or spirit, which in turn leads to sickness or symptoms of illness. It can involve weakness, appetite loss, hallucinations, withdrawal, nightmares, anxiety, and fear. This is most often seen in family members of the deceased who still feel a connection to their loved ones that have passed. Even though ghost sickness isn't recognized in the DSM-5, it still is a term used to signify cultural concepts of mood disorders and distress. Huachingo is a condition recognized among the Oglala Sioux tribe, a subgroup of the Lakota people in the northwestern United States. It describes a state of withdrawn, mute anger directed towards someone else, and it can last for multiple years. It's often a reaction to disappointment or interpersonal problems and can lead to suicide. Some Lakota people see this behavior as a strategy aimed to manipulate another person's will, but Western-trained psychiatrists often view this as a form of reactive depression, which is interesting since that's usually a short-term disorder. Huachingo literally translates to pout in the English language. This is considered an idiom of distress because pouting is not typically a specific symptom of a disorder, but it's still an emotional expression used to signify a mood disorder. Tawaddle-Yay-Snee is a condition recognized by the Dakota Sioux Nation, located most prevalently in the Great Plains of North America. The Dakota Sioux Nation is different linguistically from the Oglala Sioux population we previously discussed. Thus, they have different cultural terms to describe illness and symptoms similar to depression. This term in particular describes feelings of loss and deprivation, distracted or wandering thoughts, thoughts of suicide, death, and ghost. The term literally translates to totally discouraged. This can be considered an idiom of distress because it's a cultural expression not specific to any Western criteria for a disorder.
In my slides, we're going to talk about how culturally specific idioms of distress can mirror depression but carry unique cultural meaning. Ghost sickness, for example, includes symptoms like weakness, appetite loss, anxiety, and fear. While these align with major depressive disorder, MDD, they are deeply rooted in spiritual beliefs about the afterlife, something that can easily be overlooked in a purely clinical setting. Wasinko, recognized in the Oglala Sioux tribe, involves prolonged anger and withdrawal, sometimes lasting for years. It can often be triggered by interpersonal conflict or disappointment, and without cultural awareness, it can be misdiagnosed as severe depression or another mood disorder. Finally, Tawaddle-Yay-Snee, meaning totally discouraged, reflects deep feelings of loss, hopelessness, and thoughts of death. This distress is tied to spiritual disconnection from ancestors and community. Overall, these idioms show how important it is for healthcare providers to approach mental health through a culturally informed biopsychosocial perspective, ensuring both accurate diagnoses and care that honors cultural identity.